before the first shot was fired, before the ground shook, before the sky turned black from the smoke of collapsing fortresses, there was a machine so enormous, so unnatural, that even the men assigned to operate it spoke about it in lowered voices. This is Schwerer Gustav, the cannon that defied engineering, common sense, and maybe even the physics of its own era. Most weapons are built for war, but Gustav felt like it was built for a warning, a message cast in steel. This is what happens when fear meets ambition. It weighed as much as a small warship. Its shells fell from the sky like iron planets, and every time it fired, windows shattered miles away, and the air itself seemed to get out of its way. Yet here's the part almost no one knows. Gustav wasn't simply engineered. It was summoned. Summoned by a man terrified of concrete and fortresses, determined to crush a myth with something even more mythical. At first, soldiers approached it cautiously, unsure whether they were meant to serve it or survive it, because standing beside Gustav didn't feel like standing next to a weapon. It felt like standing next to a sleeping giant, one that might wake up angry. And on the morning when its first round was loaded, as hundreds of men lined the tracks, as the barrel darkened with rising heat, as the ground vibrated like a heartbeat, every soldier there understood one thing. Once this monster speaks, the war will never be the same again. And that's where our story begins. Crimea. Early morning. Colder than usual, cold enough that the steel rails feel like they're holding their breath. I'm standing on a narrow strip of track with my duty crew, boots frozen to the ground, hands stiff inside torn gloves as we work the rails the way we always do. Slow, methodical, pretending routine still means something during a siege. One man checks the bolts. Another knocks frost off the joints with the flat head of a hammer. A few meters away, the artillery boys laugh over a tin of tea balanced on a crate that's seen too many winters. Their breath rises in pale ribbons. The commander flips through his worn notebook, muttering targets to himself. Mechanics warm the diesel engines and test the searchlights. Tiny acts meant to convince us the world is still functioning. It feels almost peaceful, almost normal. Then the earth trembles. Barely, just a shiver under my boots like a stone dropped somewhere far below the crust. I glance toward the step, listening for a follow-up sound. Nothing. Just silence stretching across the open land. But something is wrong. On the horizon, a new shape rises through the morning haze. Too tall. Too massive. At first I think it's a building I somehow never noticed, or a ridge of rock revealed by the cold. But no, this thing is metal. This thing is moving. I narrow my eyes, heart tightening as realization crawls up my spine. We don't know it yet, not one of us standing here with numb hands and the illusion of safety, but that silhouette will change the air over Sevastopol. That shadow will rewrite what we believe is possible. And whatever hides behind this quiet morning will be worse than anything we expect. I used to believe fortresses could save men. Maybe that was naive, but when you grow up hearing about the Maginot Line, the great concrete serpent France built to stop the next war, it's hard not to imagine that walls can still matter. I remember looking at the diagrams once, long before Crimea, thinking, if something like that existed here, maybe Sevastopol would already be safe. But the truth is simpler and crueler. Every wall inspires someone to build a bigger hammer. When France collapsed in 1940 without the Germans even pointing their new siege guns at the Maginot Line, a strange rumor drifted through the ranks, that Hitler had created a weapon so massive, so absurd, it hadn't even needed to fire. 1,000-ton cannon, they said. A monster that could swallow shells as tall as a man. No one believed it. I didn't either. War breeds exaggeration the way frost breeds cracks in steel. Years later, standing on this Crimean soil, I finally understood how wrong we were. Because the East, our front, our struggle, gave that machine its true purpose. Sevastopol had refused to die. We'd fought through bombardments, air raids, starvation. We'd pushed the Germans back where no one expected resistance. And the more stubbornly we held, the more desperately they searched for something that could break us. Both sides believed the balance favored them. The Germans had the momentum, the material, the confidence earned from victories across Europe. We had the ground, the fortifications, and the relentless certainty that this city could not fall without a fight so costly it would leave scars across history. But even then something felt wrong. A pressure in the air, as if the old rules, the ones written in artillery ranges, concrete thickness, and human endurance, were starting to fray at the edges. I remember hearing older officers whisper that the Germans were preparing something different for us. Something that didn't fit into the usual calculations of siege warfare. We thought it meant heavier bombers, new Stuka tactics, or maybe fresh divisions. None of us imagined what was actually coming. And as I watched the horizon that morning, staring at the unfamiliar silhouette crawling into view, I felt it in my bones. Whatever the Germans had brought to Sevastopol, it wasn't a weapon meant to breach walls. It was a weapon meant to erase the idea of walls altogether. I had seen German preparations before, methodical, cold, almost ritualistic, but nothing like what unfolded in the days before the monster arrived. Their engineers crawled over the landscape like ants rebuilding a nest, laying twin rails with a precision that felt unnatural in a war where chaos usually ruled. From my observation post, I watched them through cracked binoculars, surveyors marking angles, sappers clearing debris, armored tractors tugging at machinery that looked too heavy for anything with wheels. At first, none of us understood what could possibly require its own railway. Even our heaviest guns were dragged in parts by tractors or horses. But the Germans operated with a strange certainty, as if they were following instructions written months, or years, before the siege even began. Every bolt, every tie, every timber went into place under a kind of grim confidence. When their armored train finally rolled onto those rails, I felt the mood among my comrades shift. The carriages were reinforced, wrapped in steel plates, painted in dull gray. Crewmen moved across them with a calm that bordered on reverence. I remember turning to my friend Mikhail and whispering, "Whatever they're bringing, they think it will finish us." He didn't answer. He just watched the horizon and tightened his grip on his rifle. Everything about the German plan was built on precision. First, establish the rail bed. Then anchor the firing platform. Then clear arcs of fire so wide that even our deepest bunkers could be reached. The logic was flawless, mathematically perfect. And for a moment, I feared that perfection might actually be enough to break us. But even the Germans weren't prepared for what their own creation would unleash. The first shot came without warning, no shell scream, no rising whistle. Just an explosion so enormous the air itself seemed to buckle. I was thrown into the dirt as though a giant hand had swatted me aside. The sky turned black with dust. Vehicles rattled. Men fell to their knees, clutching their helmets and ears. I tasted earth, metal, and something bitter, fear maybe. Real fear. The kind that sinks into your bones. When I lifted my head, a massive ring of smoke spiraled upward, as if the horizon itself had been torn open. Someone shouted, "That wasn't artillery." Another yelled, "What the hell was that?" But deep down we all knew, whatever we had believed about fortress warfare, concrete thickness, or survivability had just evaporated. This wasn't fire. This wasn't bombardment. This was an announcement, one that screamed the old logic of war was dead. After that first shot, the siege changed overnight. No, the world changed. Every day after felt like living inside the echo of something too big to comprehend. I'd wake before dawn, heart already pounding, waiting for the next blast, the next tremor, the next sign that the earth itself was about to rebel under the weight of that machine. Our positions didn't crumble in a single moment, they eroded piece by piece. The Germans tried pushing forward again and again, testing us like a knife tests its edge against bone. Each time we held, they shifted tactics. New infantry waves. New armored assaults. New artillery patterns. It was as if the gun on rails dictated the rhythm of the battlefield, and every German unit adjusted its pulse to match. We responded with everything we had. Counter-battery teams sprinted across open ground to relocate after every salvo. Communications officers screamed into radios that cut out mid-sentence. Sappers redrew defensive lines only to watch them vanish under soil heaved skyward by blasts deeper and more violent than anything we'd seen before. But the chaos didn't belong to us alone. The monster strained under its own violence. Word reached us that its barrel had to be scrubbed, regauged, cooled, sometimes for hours, after only a handful of shots. Mechanics worked like surgeons trying to keep a collapsing giant alive. We could see them through field scopes, tiny silhouettes swarming over steel limbs, checking rivets, tightening braces, wiping smoke from metal so hot it shimmered in the morning cold. German officers argued constantly. We intercepted fragments of their radio chatter, heated voices debating whether to fire from their current position or risk moving the behemoth closer. Even they were afraid of the stresses tearing through their creation. Even they didn't fully control it. And new dangers revealed themselves with every bombardment we endured. Bunkers we thought were safe rattled like tin cans. Underground galleries collapsed, burying ammunition or men, or both. Hidden batteries we counted on for support were exposed by shockwaves that shifted entire layers of soil. Every phase of the battle grew more unpredictable, more unstable. The Germans expected our lines to break cleanly, like a beam under pressure. Instead, they splintered and twisted, forcing them to rethink every assumption they carried into this siege. But the truth we felt, every one of us standing beneath that impossible weapon, was simpler and darker. We weren't just fighting the enemy anymore. We were fighting a machine that shouldn't have existed. A machine that was breaking not only our defenses, but the very rules we once believed governed war. War usually blurs people into shapes, helmets, coats, silhouettes running through smoke. But after the monster began firing, every face around me sharpened in terrible clarity, as if the gun's shockwaves hammered detail into us. I remember the first man I saw changed by it, a young gunner named Oleg. He'd been stationed near one of our forward batteries, proud of his eyesight, boasting he could spot a German observer before the man even raised his binoculars. After the first blast, Oleg stumbled back to our camp with his pupils blown wide, his gaze unfocused. The flash had burned something inside him. He kept whispering, "I didn't blink. I didn't blink," as if he were confessing a crime. We all had moments like that, small collapses, private fractures. Even Captain Varnin, who never wavered during the worst bombardments of the early siege, began to hesitate when giving orders. One night I caught him staring at the horizon, his hands trembling just enough to be seen in the lantern light. "If this is what one shot does," he murmured, "what happens when they fire a dozen?" He didn't expect an answer. None of us had one. Our mechanics suffered the most quietly. They worked through nights that felt carved from ice, scraping metal fragments from damaged gun shields, patching cracked armor plates, tightening every bolt that might shake loose under the next tremor. I saw grease mixed with blood on their gloves more than once, not from injury but from scraping their hands raw in desperation. They didn't pray for victory. They prayed the equipment would survive another day. Medics were overwhelmed in ways no training prepared them for. Men crawled into the aid stations half buried in dust, bleeding from ears and noses, unable to stand after the ground thrummed under them for hours. Cave-ins became a new kind of casualty. Soldiers dragged out pale and choking, lungs filled with powdered concrete. I carried 3 such men myself. Only one lived long enough to gasp a thank you. Letters home grew stranger. Some men wrote about the gun as if it were a storm. Others described it like a living creature, an iron beast whose roar hollowed them out. My own letter stayed unfinished for weeks. Every time I tried to put words on paper, the next blast tore the thought from me. The worst part was how the monster warped our sense of scale. Tanks, bombs, machine guns, things that once defined the battlefield, felt suddenly small. We weren't simply resisting an army anymore. We were enduring something that frightened even the men who built it. The day everything broke began without warning. No red flare on the horizon, no scouts sprinting back with reports. Just a stillness so sharp it felt like the world had paused to inhale. I was positioned near an observation trench, running on cold tea and less sleep when the air changed. You could feel it before you heard it, like pressure building inside your chest. Even the birds had fled the sky. When the shot came, it was different from all the others. The ground didn't just shake, it convulsed, a deep-bellied roar that turned soil into liquid for a heartbeat. I grabbed the trench wall to stay upright as dust poured over me like a collapsing ceiling. Somewhere to my right, someone screamed that the earth had split open. A moment later the shockwave hit, flattening what little remained of our outer defenses. We didn't know it then, but Gustav's shell had struck the underground ammunition depot, the one buried so deep our engineers once insisted it was untouchable. I had walked past its entrance many times, comforted by the thickness of the rock above it. That comfort vanished in a single instant. The explosion that followed was not a sound but a force, a rising column of fire and debris that clawed at the sky and painted the steppe in orange light. For a moment, everything went silent. No gunfire. No orders. Just the ringing in our ears and the weight of realization settling like ash. A part of the city's backbone had just been snapped. When the noise returned, it was chaos. Radios spat static mixed with panicked voices. Units shouted different orders: fall back, hold position, regroup, retreat. No 2 commands matched. Men surged in every direction, some running toward the smoke believing comrades were trapped, others sprinting away from the collapsing tunnels. I moved with them, half guiding, half being pulled along, feeling the line unravel under my feet. The Germans sensed it. Their artillery shifted instantly, pounding the weakened sectors with cruel precision. I could see their infantry advancing through the haze, silhouettes weaving between shattered emplacements. They weren't charging, they were harvesting. Every structure still standing became a target. Every path we used to call familiar turned into a trap. By nightfall, the air tasted of concrete dust and burned cordite. Our guns sputtered with cracked barrels. Our supplies thinned to nothing. Even the bravest among us looked hollowed out, lit only by the flames devouring the hillside. Sevastopol didn't fall in a dramatic surge. It collapsed like a man who has endured too many blows. And when the monster finally fell silent, when the Germans stopped firing, we were left staring at a battlefield that felt less like a place fought over and more like a warning carved into the earth. The victory they claimed tasted like ash, even to them. When the firing finally ceased, the silence felt wrong, too wide, too empty, as if the world had been hollowed out by the monster's last command. I walked across ground that no longer resembled the landscape I had known. Trenches were flattened, bunkers peeled open like tin cans, and the shattered remains of our guns jutted from the soil at strange angles. Smoke drifted in thin veils, carrying the bitter scent of burnt oil and pulverized stone. The siege wasn't just over. It had been ended, cut short by a weapon that demanded more from the earth than any army should ever ask. We heard the Germans dismantling the rails within hours, their engines clanking, men shouting in curt, weary voices. Even in victory, they moved with the drag of exhaustion. Through my binoculars, I saw crews crawling over the giant like mourners stripping a body for burial. The barrel hung low, scorched black at the edges. Plates were warped, braces bent. The machine had fired itself to the point of ruin. I almost felt pity, almost. Later, when prisoners spoke about it, their tone surprised me. You would expect pride in such a weapon. But the men who served it sounded drained, even ashamed. It was too big, one German sapper muttered during interrogation. Too slow. Too fragile. A circus animal, not a weapon. Another added, we built it for a war that ended before it reached the field. Their words lingered with a strange echo, confirming what we felt deep inside. The monster wasn't a symbol of German strength. It was a confession of their desperation. Reports after the war only deepened that truth. Engineers admitted the logistics were impossible, the cost obscene, the mobility laughable. They had tried to use it again near Leningrad, but the operation collapsed. They tried to reposition it, but the rails failed. In the final months, they dismantled it themselves, not to protect a secret, but because the burden of dragging a dying giant across a dying front had become unbearable. Standing amid the ruins of Sevastopol, I realized something I hadn't understood during the siege. The gun hadn't killed our city. Time had. Time, and the refusal of commanders on both sides to admit that the age of colossal machines was ending. The myth that size meant power died here, beneath the shadow of a cannon too large for its own purpose. As I left the wreckage behind, one lesson fixed itself in my mind. War is not won by giants. It is won by speed, precision, logistics, and the quiet mathematics of innovation. The future would belong not to monsters on rails, but to weapons that moved faster than fear. And I wondered, as the sun set over the broken harbor, what myths our own generation still believed. Myths waiting for a monster of their own to finally break them.